All right. Thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Boris Hertzlet. I am the program manager for Guam PTAC, the Procurement Technical Assistance Center. The slide tells you a little bit about what we do. We provide one-on-one counseling services as well as group workshops and webinars like this for companies that are going after government contracts. So if you're going after a local government contract or a federal government contract, we're here to assist. We are funded by a grant from the Department of Defense through the Defense Logistics Agency, and the University of Guam hosts our program. So we have offices over at UOG inside the School of Business, rooms 116 and 117, which is when you're looking at the School of Business and you walk in, go to the right and down the right corridor, and our offices are the last two offices on the right. Also, we have some sponsors for our program for FY22. Bank of Guam gave us some office space. So we have an office over at the Upper Tumon branch, and you can see Francine, she's over at that office. Also Gita, 5th floor ITC building. They gave us office space. So you can see Frank, he's over at Gita. And GTA has donated cell phones to our counselors as well as phone service and internet over at the Bank of Guam. So thank you very much for that, GTA. Some of the highlights in our program, we have over 600 active clients. We actually have about 1,800 clients in our database, but so about a third of them are active at any given time looking for contracts and subcontracts for government projects. Last year, those clients won over $180 million in contracts and subcontracts, and we've helped over 150 clients get HubZone certified, which is the common small business certification on Guam, just because all of Guam and even all of the CNMI are hub zones, so it makes it easy to get that certification. You don't have to worry about where your business is located or where your employees reside, because all the businesses are located in a hub zone and all the employees are residing in a hub zone. So that's one of the other things we can assist with. So with respect to government contracting, federal contracting, we can help you from the very beginning. You know, you need to get a DUNS number and you need to register your company in SAM, which is basically the system for award management, a database of anybody who wants to be a federal contractor. They need to be registered in that database, and we can help you with those processes. And then when you want to find opportunities, we can help you do that. When you find something you want to bid on, we can help you with your quote and your proposal. We just obviously can't price it for you, but we can give you tips and suggestions to what include and not include. And then win or lose, we can help you with the debrief process. You are entitled to a debrief with respect to federal contracting. However, you do need to request it, and there are time limits involved. So we can help you with all that. So start to finish of the procurement process. Should you win a contract and it's a Department of Defense contract, which about 99.5% of all of them on Guam are DOD contracts that are coming from the federal government, we can help you with the billing process because they use something known as WAF, the wide area workflow. So if you need help in putting an invoice, we can help you with that as well. All of our services are free of charge. It's all paid for with your tax dollars, so please use us. We are here to be used. Some of the partners that we work with, the SBA, the HubZone program, like I mentioned, is one of their programs. It's a small business, known as a small business set-aside program. So small businesses can get certified in different things. One of them is the HubZone. There's also the 8A program for businesses that have socially and economically disadvantaged owners. There's also the women-owned small business program. So for that, the business must be majority owned and full and unconditionally owned by women or a woman. And there's the service-disabled veteran-owned small business program, which currently is a self-certification, but it will become an official certification. I think around 2023 is when it's scheduled to become that. And so there will be processes in place, probably be very similar to the women-owned and their process. And then there's the small business mentor protege program. So a small business can team up with a large business and still go after small business contracts, which is normally not the case, as long as they put a mentor protege agreement together and the SBA approves that mentor protege agreement. So if you want to get involved with any other thing, those certifications related to small businesses, we can help you with those certifications. If you want to get into business development, you want to start a business, expand your business, get some QuickBooks training, we do not assist with that. You need to go see the folks over at the Small Business Development Center. They're also located here at UOG inside the School of Business, where we are on the right side of the building. They are on the left side of the building. And you can go see them and they will help you put your business plan together, talk about business development, QuickBooks training, all that kind of stuff. Like I said, we strictly focus on government contracting. Also, if you need help with anything related to the pandemic, the fundings, the grants, all the different money associated with that, again, go see the folks at the SBDC. We do not assist with those types of things. We strictly focus on government contracting. We are also a member of APTAC, which is the Association of Procurement Technical Assistance Centers, about 95, 96 PTACs across the country. And so we have an association we can go to find out what's going on, all the new latest and greatest with government contracting, as well as what usually comes in handy is if there's an issue that we're seeing that we haven't seen before, we'll go to our association and see if anyone else has experienced that issue. For example, maybe SAM's not working or the search feature is not working. We can go and check our association. Normally someone will say, oh, yep, it's not working. And this is what they did to resolve it. Or they got some inside information from SAM of when it's going to be fixed or whatever it is. So we can find out potential solutions for problems that people are having. All right, so those are our resource partners, and that's the Guam PTAC. So like I said, all of our service is free of charge. Please use this. It's already paid for with your tax dollars. Take advantage. So today, the topic we're going to talk about is the Buy American Act. And this, it's very easy, right? Everybody knows the Buy American Act. So this webinar will be over in about 5 minutes because it's a very simple act. Actually, that's not the case at all. It's a very complex act. And we'll do our best to dive into this and talk about how the act works, all the different exemptions. There are a ton of exemptions with the Buy American Act and all the related laws associated with the Buy American Act, as well as some upcoming developments that President Joe Biden has initiated through executive order. So let's get started here. So the Buy American Act came about in 1933, and it's basically to protect domestic businesses, selling American-made products. Applies to products, construction materials, not really to services, unless those services are using a lot of products. Then the products that are involved in the services might have to be, or might have to follow the Buy American Act. But it's mainly for products and construction materials. There's price preferences for domestic products and construction materials. So we'll talk about those price preferences as we go along here. It's rarely amended. They might adjust, tweak some numbers, add, raise some price preferences, raise some testing preferences, maybe add a country or take a country off the trade agreements list. But basically, the Buy American Act has been around for a long time and it gets very little adjustment, except for recently with this new executive order that came out last January, where there could be some pretty big changes to the Buy American Act. And it links to other trade agreements. So we'll talk about the different trade agreements as we go along here as well. Like I said earlier in the intro, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat or you can save them till the end. And if you're having any issues or anything, feel free to unmute yourself and just say, hey, stop, what's going on here, or if you're not seeing the screen. So the Buy American Act starts in the FAR. FAR is the Federal Acquisition Regulations, right? It's basically the Bible of federal contracting. And FAR 25-100 basically implements the Buy American Act, which is 41 USC Chapter 83. And the trade agreements are all in there, and the other laws and all the regulations and all the exemptions are listed in there. So basically it sets the policies and procedures for how the US government is supposed to be purchasing supplies and construction materials for contracts. So let's talk about supplies first. The supplies and construction materials are a little different. I mean, the rules are very similar, but we'll just separate them here for a bit. So with respect to supplies, so this is when the Buy American Act kicks in and when you need to follow the rules. Anything above the micro purchase threshold, so which is currently 10,000 as per the 2018 NBAA. So that means anything under 10,000, the Buy American Act does not apply, right? Now, of course, there can be exceptions. Contracting officers can make exceptions, but in general, I should preface that with everything I say today, just know everything I'm saying is in general. If it's above, the Buy American Act doesn't kick in until we get above the micro purchase threshold. And then it kind of stops once we reach the floor of the trade agreements. So trade agreements kick in usually at about 180,000 for supplies and 7 million for construction. So what that means is once we have a trade agreement coming in, let's say you want to supply, I don't know, I'm just going to desks from, I believe, let's say Korea. I believe we have a trade agreement with Korea, and the contract looks to be it's going to be more than $180,000 worth of stuff. Then the Buy American Act will not apply anymore. So it's basically that threshold between 10,000 and 180 for supplies. Now, of course, there can be considerations. Contracting offers can make requirements that stuff needs to be U.S. made. If there's small business set-asides involved over that $180,000, then of course the Buy American Act will apply. It's here to protect small businesses and U.S.-based businesses. So there can be exceptions, but like I said, in general, so we're talking about a window of 10,000 and 180,000 for supplies, and 10,000 and actually I don't know, I forget what the micro purchase threshold for construction is. I believe it might be like 250,000 and 7 million for construction. So, and this is only for sale of supplies for use in the U.S. That's where these rules come into place. So if you're selling to Japan and things like that, Buy American Act generally will not apply. And that's because if you're, a contractor in Japan, building things in Japan, even though it's for U.S. base, you probably want to use the local manufacturing and suppliers as much as possible, because it's a benefit to the local area. All right. Guam, and for this purposes, Guam is considered part of the U.S., so the Buy American Act does apply on Guam, in case anyone is wondering about that. All right. So FAR 25001. Restricts the purchase of supplies that are not domestic end products. So we're going to talk a little bit about what does that mean? What's a domestic end product? And requires, with some exceptions, the use of only domestic construction materials. So there's a difference between construction materials and end products. All right, so in FAR 25.101, I put a little link there that you can click on once I send you a copy of this, and I will send you a copy of this presentation sometime this afternoon, as well as a link to the webinar that you can watch on YouTube. But it's basically a two-part test to decide if an end product, right, is something that's if it's domestic or not. This is how we find out if something is American-made, basically. And this is the test that's described in the Buy American Act. So number one, it must be manufactured in the USA. And number two, the cost of the components, the domestic components, must exceed 55% of the cost of all the components. So we need to kind of define here then what's an end product, what's manufactured, and what's components. What do those things mean, right? This used to be 50%. It was recently changed to 55%, and it'll probably go up some more depending on how fast Joe Biden's executive order gets put into the FAR. But currently it is at 55% for the component test. Unless it is a COTS item. What is COTS? COTS is commercial off the shelf. Then the component test does not apply. So number two doesn't apply, but number one still applies. It must be manufactured in the USA. If the end product is iron or steel, then it needs to be at least 95% of the components involved must be domestic components. So there's a big, huge push to use U.S. steel. That's what that's saying right there. Now, Department of Defense, they have their own rule. They can take it a little further. And sometime, I think they might have updated this. Maybe I have to go check this again, but DFARS is the Department of Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, basically. And so they can usually make things more stringent, or in this case, it looks like it's a little less stringent, but the end product must be manufactured in the USA and the cost of its USA and qualifying country components. So they throw in this qualifying country, and I know it's kind of confusing right now, but that'll pop up when we talk about the Trade Agreement Act and how those apply for Department of Defense contracts. And we kind of care a lot about Department of Defense contracts because, like I said, 99 98.5% of all the contracts on Guam, federal contracts, are coming from the DOD. So we really want to know what their rules are. Components exceed 50% of the cost of all components. I'm going to double check that this afternoon just to make sure that didn't raise to 55 as well. But I will double check that and make sure that we have the right number when I send you the slides. Okay. So those are the basic rules. So let's find out what's an end product. What does manufactured mean? Because these are kind of broad definitions. Manufactured could mean a whole lot of things. And what's a component? So an end product is defined as articles, materials, supplies to be acquired for public use. So basically things that are already in the end form that they will be used as, right? So if we're thinking of maybe a television, the end product is the television. The components would be all the things that make up the television inside the television. So maybe, I don't know, some speakers, whatever used for the screens, whatever is used to make a television. And so this definition is kind of broad for an end product because problems do arise, and this is usually when court cases come into play. You know, and the problems arise when you're purchasing a system. So are components of a system actually an end product in themselves? And that the biggest example you can come away with from that is like a computer. Let's say a government office wants to purchase, I don't know, 10 computers and they want to hook them all up on a network. Well, are the computers themselves end products, or is the entire network the end product? So that's when problems occur, and then people need to figure out, okay, so then which parts, where do we do the test? Do we do it on the entire network itself, or do we do it on each component of each computer that's in the network? So, and how the court cases usually rule is they figure out what the purpose of the procurement is, and that's going to determine what the end product is. So probably in the case of a network, they'll say, well, you know, the purpose of the procurement is to get an entire network, just not just a bunch of computers. So the end product would be the network. That's probably how they would decide. But if you want to know more about it, you can go to gao.gov. There's a bunch of court cases there, and you can see, probably search Buy American on their search, and you can find out all the different court cases related to Buy American and kind of get the idea of what rulings the government GAO is coming away with when they're determining if things actually are American-made end products or not. What is meant by manufactured? Now, this is something you think would be really defined in the Buy American Act. It's not defined at all. There's no definition in the Buy American Act. No executive order has ever defined what you mean by manufacturing. And there's nowhere in the FAR where you find a definition of manufactured. So that leads to court cases, obviously. And because people, you know, if I buy something from a different country and I rebox it and maybe add a few stickers to the product, does that count as manufacturing? I'm doing something, I'm adding something to it, you know. And so GAO defines it as the product completed in the form required by the agency, which kind of ties into the end product definition, right? It's the last form. Court cases will come in when it goes to court, and they'll say, you know what, there needs to be some substantial changes in the physical character. Some changes have been made to this product, and that's why it's being considered manufactured. And there need to be some maybe separate stages of manufacturing, you know, or is it separate, or is it one continuous process? And they'll look at that. And obviously, if it's separate, then they'll say, well, you know, there's probably more chance this thing was manufactured in the US. Operations performed after product is complete are not manufacturing. So changing a box, just testing the product, you know, adding the stickers, have they decided that's not manufacturing because that's after the product's already complete. So I think there's an example here, and this is an old example. This came from a Congressional Research Service document when they were doing some, you know, a report on the Buy American Act and the preference for domestic supplies, and they basically said, you know, look, since there's no definition of manufacturing, we just got to look at every case by case. So in this one case, there's I think a bid for fax machines, 2 fax machines offered by the same vendor. So you can tell this is a while ago because I don't think people even use fax machines anymore. And both fax machines incorporated commercial Japanese fax machines. And so GAO found that one machine at least 50% of it, the cost of its components. So back then it was 50%, not 55, was manufactured in the US because the vendor performed a number of assembly operations in the US. So basically they were adding parts to and taking out parts to the machine when they got it from Japan. And so then they're basically transforming it into something the government wanted. In the other case, the fax machine was found not to be compliant because all they did was replace one circuit. So what you can see from this example is it's a case-by-case basis. Doing one thing was probably not going to qualify as manufacturing. There needs to be a few things done to transform the product from wherever you got it into the end product that the government's going to use for it to be considered manufactured in the United States. Okay, I know that's still a little iffy and that doesn't clear things up 100%, but that is the best we got at this time. What's a component? A component is basically an article, material, or supply incorporated directly into an end product or construction material. So components can be deemed to be manufactured in the US regardless of their actual place of origin. So if the end product in which they're incorporated is manufactured in the US, then those components, and the components are found to be, we don't make enough in the US, it's not, there's not sufficient quantity, it's not reasonably be available, the quality is not there, so you're using maybe foreign made components, they'll be considered US made components because they'll meet those two criteria there. Again, this is very subjective and a lot of court cases come into play. All right, for construction materials, it's any article, material, or supply brought to the construction site by a contractor for incorporation into the building work. So this is stuff that the contractor, let's say they want a construction contract to build a building and they're bringing materials on site to build that building. Those would be considered construction material, not supplies, because the government did not buy those directly from the contractor. They're part of the contract to build the building. FAR 25201 says the government should only be using domestic construction materials in construction contracts. And then there's a little note there, materials purchased directly by the government are supplies, not construction materials. So, if the contractors bring in their own, they're putting up, let's say, a steel frame building and they're bringing their own steel to the website, to the job site, that would be considered construction material. However, if the government had purchased the steel directly and said, here, Mr. Contractor, here's the steel we want to use, then that steel would be considered supplies. So that's the little distinction there is. FAR 25003 says construction material is considered domestic if it's mined or produced in the USA, or it's manufactured in the USA and the cost of components exceeds 55% of the cost of all the components. So pretty similar to that test we saw earlier for supplies. If it's steel, iron, then it's 95%. The components need to be 95% of US origin. And then foreign components can be considered domestic if the non-availability determinations are in effect. We'll talk a little bit more about those, but like we mentioned, there's not enough quantity in the US for the components. They're not of the right quality, whatever it is. There are different reasons. And there are some more non-availability determinations. And so here we go. Here are the exceptions. So this applies both to supplies and construction materials, and you can find them in the FAR 25103 and 25202. Agency heads, contracting officers, they can purchase foreign end products if these, conditions or one of these conditions exists. So if the domestic goods are inconsistent with public interest, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. If the domestic goods are unavailable, right? So if we just they're not made in the US, the price of the domestic goods is unreasonable. They are made in the US, but they're just way too expensive. If it's IT and it's procured through commercial off the shelf, well, there's an exemption for that. And then if they're going to resell it in the commissary, except for construction materials, which would make no sense, right? Because if it's the government purchased directly, it wouldn't be called construction materials, it would be a supply. If they're for resale in the commissary, that's why the commissary can sell non-US made stuff. So that's the public interest comes into play when you have an agreement with a foreign government on exceptions to the Buy American Act. And so as well as if there's to ensure access to state-of-the-art commercial technology, to maintain the same source of supply for spare and replacement parts. So maybe the government, let's look at Naval Hospital. They purchased some equipment that's not made in the US, maybe some kinds of machines or some kind of diagnostic equipment, and they need the spare parts. And so they're going to keep buying the non-US made because that's the stuff that's going to work with the equipment they have. So that kind of deal is public interest. It's in the public interest. DOD has also taken a little further with respect to these countries in this list you see here. They've basically said if you buy your products from these countries, and these products are made in these countries, and you sell them to us, they are going to be considered U.S. made. Period. End of story. That's the rule for DOD. So if you're selling them Canadian made stuff, Egyptian made stuff, Israeli made stuff, they're going to be considered that the restrictions of the Buy American Act do not apply to these countries and products. Austria is also, it's not on the list, but they're a case-by-case country, so it depends what the product is. Now, of course, this is an exception to the Buy American Act, and of course, there needs to be an exception to the exception. So in cases of national defense, DOD can put a stop to it and say, well, you know what, I know our rules say we're going to treat these French-made products as American. However, in regards to national defense, we're not going to do that for this certain product, right? So probably comes more into place with bombs and missiles and bullets and things like that. So you can find this list at DFARS 225872-1, and I believe it hasn't changed. This is the same list. It's been this way for a long time. Okay, so some more exceptions. Unavailable. All right, so if domestic sources can only meet 50% or less of U.S. demand, then that domestic not end product component is going to be considered unavailable. That supply, that construction material is going to be considered unavailable, and you might be able to use foreign sources. There's already some examples here. Items not reasonably available from domestic sources, so spare replacement parts. That kind of I used that example already. One big one is foreign drugs. Philadelphia, they're allowed to buy at the Defense Supply Center all the foreign drugs they want just because they're not available in the US. So unavailability is another exception that can be used for the government to purchase non-domestic products. And here's a big list that's available. You can find this at FAR 25104. These are already determined to be non-available in the quantities needed in the US. So these are usually purchased from foreign, these are foreign products, basically. I see coconut meat. Interesting. Cobra venom. Not sure why we would need that. Maybe for antidotes and things like that. I'm not sure. All right, then of course, unreasonable price. So there, if something is an unreasonable price, there would be some price preference guidelines that you would need to follow to use foreign products. We'll talk about that here now. So price preferences. So these are detailed in FAR 25105 and DFARS 225105. But basically, if the domestic offer is not the lowest, so the US made product, let's say you're offering in your proposal, then a percentage is added to the lowest offer before determining the best price. So let's say, this obviously comes into play in full and open competition. This is not for small business set-asides, right? Because the small business side Buy American Act does apply. And so this is going to be for usually full and open competition. And what they're saying is if the domestic offer is not lowest, that means the foreign offer is the lowest. So they're going to add a percentage to the foreign offer's bid or their proposal to bump it up, to put everything on a level playing field, because we're supposed to be protecting domestic offers. So these percentages used to be 6% and 12%. They were recently raised to 20 and 30, I think maybe in 2019, 2020. So basically, if the foreign offer, if the lowest domestic offer is a large business, they're going to add 20% to that foreign offerer's price. If the lowest domestic offer is a small business, then they're going to add 30% to that foreign offerer's price. So, you know, it's basically here to protect the small businesses. Agencies can go with higher percentages, and DOD has. DOD will add 50%. Small or large, doesn't matter. If you're a foreign offerer, we're going to add 50% to your price, and then we're going to compare it to the American products and see who's got the best price. If tied, domestic offer wins. So, and these price references do not apply to offers of eligible products if the acquisition is subject to a trade agreement. We haven't talked about the trade agreements yet, but we'll get there here soon. So let me show you how this example works in real life. I've never actually seen this happen, and I don't know too many people who have, but if you have, it'd be great to share your experience maybe at the end of this webinar. But this is kind of how it's supposed to work according to the FAR. So let's say an agency needed 500 desks, right? And a foreign offerer offered, okay, we can supply those 500 desks for 50 grand. And the domestic offerer, who is a large business, says, well, you know what, we can do it too, but it's going to cost 65 grand. Well, you would add 20% to the foreign offer in a normal government agency, a federal agency, and that would raise their price to 60 grand. And so in this case, the foreign offer would still win, but there is an asterisk there, and I'll get to the asterisk in a second. Let's look at another example. An agency, same example, agency needs 500 desks, but in this example, the domestic offer is a small business, right? So foreign offer again says we can do it for 50, the domestic offer says we can do it for 65. Now we're going to add 30%, right? Because that's the price preference for the small business domestic offer. And that'll raise the foreign offer's price to 65,000. So now there's a tie. Tie goes to the American company, domestic offer win. Now, if it's a Department of Defense that needs the 500 desks, remember, they don't care what size the domestic offer is, but they're going to add 50%. So the domestic offer can actually offer 75 grand and still be the winner because they're going to add 50% to the foreign offer's price. So tie goes to the domestic offer, right? So this is in general how it works. And like I said, I've never seen this actually come into play, but it must happen somewhere. The one with the asterisk, the large foreign, the large domestic business and the foreign offer was still the lower price. So in general, the agency would award to the foreign offer, as long as everything is permitted under the Buy American Act, and they could use the unreasonable domestic costs because they gave the price preference and they still were lower. But they can also reject the foreign offer if it has adverse effect on public interest. So it could be a national security thing. It could be something about it's still going to harm the businesses in the area, whatever. So there are things the agency could do to try to get the offer to go to the domestic offer. But they can't just flat out reject it because the lowest offer is foreign. They'd have to come up with a reason. So that's why I put a little asterisk. All right, now let's talk about trade agreements. So the Trade Agreements Act of 1979, this is listed out in FAR 25400. And this is where certain foreign products can be treated as domestic. So we have a bunch of agreements. United States has a bunch of agreements with a bunch of different countries. And there's a bunch of rules in place. Okay, we'll make this trade agreement with you where we can sell, these 1,000 different products to your country. Your country can sell your 1,000 different products to us. We're not going to put any tariffs in or anything like that. We're just going to have free trade, right? We're going to have a trade agreement going on here. And so with respect to government contracting, they said, well, okay, well, if we have that deal, then those products that we're allowing you to sell to us, we're going to consider those domestic products as well. Those will be considered US made. So this is basically the rules of the trade agreements. There's a bunch of waivers of regulations for eligible products coming from foreign countries. Products that are manufactured, substantially transformed, may be treated the same as domestic ones. So there are exceptions to this, of course. Again, the whole purpose of the Buy American Act is to protect small businesses. So the Trade Agreement Act does not apply to small business set-asides. So I'll get to that in a second when I show you the thresholds, but it does not apply to acquisition for ammunition or materials of national defense. Again, that's the national defense issue coming into play. So even though we have an agreement with, let's say, I don't know, let's use Korea as an example, we're probably not going to be buying ammunition from Korea or things like that. I'm sorry. And it doesn't apply to end products for resale. So this is kind of like the commissary thing. If you're going to sell things in the commissary, they'll just let them in. They're foreign anyway. So if full and open competition, then the Trade Agreement Act applies. I'm sorry, excuse me for 1 second. So you can see FAR 25402 and DFARS 225.4, and they'll have the various trade agreements, thresholds, and product service groups. And I think I have a screenshot here. So this is what's currently listed in the FAR. So what this is telling you, let's say, let's look at Australia. Australia Free Trade Agreement. So if a supply contract is equal to or exceeding $182,000, then the Trade Agreement Act kicks in, and those supplies would be considered U.S. made, as long as those products are part of that trade agreement we have with Australia. I'm sorry, not at 83,099. Anything under that, you would follow the Buy American Act rules, and those Australian products would not be considered domestic products, right? You'd actually have to go through the whole price preference deal. Also, if this was a small business size, so just because the limits or the floor basically of the Trade Agreement Act kicking in is 83,000 for Australia, if let's say we were buying, I don't know, let's go back to desks again, and we're allowed to get desks from Australia. That's that's a product that is part of our trade agreement. And so an Australian company says, hey, yeah, we will supply, and let's say the supply contract is $100,000 contract. Basically, they'll say, hey, you know, we can supply Australian made desks because we're part of the free trade agreement. We have a trade agreement, and that is, you know, that's the floor is 83,000, and we're already at 100,000. So these will count as U.S. made. Well, if the solicitation or the contract was set aside for a small business or a hub zone or anything like that, well, obviously the Australian companies wouldn't be able to supply it directly, but if they were going through a U.S. vendor, they would not. These trade agreements would not apply because the small business rules are in place. And again, the Buy American Act is there to protect small businesses. So they would have to go through the price preference situation. So this really only applies, these thresholds only come into play, or these floors only come into play when it's really full and open competition. And so you can see for supplies, services, again, that's only if there's a bunch of supplies involved in the service, and construction is usually around 7 million. Now, these were recently updated. And so this, I just checked the FAR today, and since it had not been updated in the FAR, but these are the new thresholds as of January 1st of 2022. And it really didn't change much. So for example, let's go back one slide. Australia was at 83, now it's at 92. Bahrain is at 183 now, and before it was at 182, so only $1,000 difference. And I think construction really hasn't changed much. 7,032,000 used to be 7,008,000, so it went up about 24,000. So that's how the Free Trade Agreement Acts work. How do we enforce all these things? How is the government enforcing all this? Well, if you remember, to be a government contractor, you need to register in SAM, right? The System for Award Management. And while you're registering your company in SAM, there's a section in there known as the Representations and Certifications, where they ask, I believe, 44 questions. And a couple of those questions deal with, hey, Mr. Company, where are you buying your products? Where are they coming from? Are they coming from foreign? Are they foreign end products? And you're supposed to be saying in your SAM, yes or no. Or there's a third option that most people prefer, where it says vendors will, basically, I will let the government know when I bid on something. Information will be supplied to the government at the time that is necessary. So let's say you're bidding on something and your SAM, you had picked that third option where you haven't really listed if any of your supplies or end products are coming from foreign countries. Then, you know, when you bid on something, you'd have to let them know. So you'd have this basically a Buy American Act certificate. It's outlined in FAR 52.225-2. It kind of looks like this, where you would list, all right, for, you know, line item number, let's say let's go back to this desk example. The government's looking to buy some desks. So you would say line item number, whatever it is in the solicitation, 0001. The desk we're going to supply, our country of origin is Australia, or our country of origin is France or Germany, whatever it was. And so if you're not listing it in your SAM, you would list it when you, at the time of making your proposal or your quote. If you're unsure, FAR 52225-1, you can obtain from the contracting officer a list of foreign articles that the contracting officer will treat as domestic. So that's what it says in the FAR. So your contracting officer actually is supposed to be the one that can decide if they're going to allow a foreign article or component, not component, a supply, an end product, if they're going to allow that to be treated as domestic. So talk to your contracting officer. Some more enforcement on construction materials. There is, this one, I'm sorry to go back a slide. This was for supplies. For construction, so this is when you're selling stuff directly to the government. For construction materials, so materials that contractors are bringing onto a job site to use in the construction of whatever they're building, there no certificate is required, but they can obtain something from the contracting officer as per FAR 25.203. You know, if something is inapplicable for specific construction materials. So if they want to use certain foreign materials, obviously, I believe steel would be a big problem. That probably would not be allowed, but there might be some other foreign materials you might need. You're going to have to let the contracting officer know, and this is pre-award basically. So as part of your, when you're maybe put it in your questions when there's an RFI, a request for information, or you can put it in your price proposal when you're submitting your proposal. But you would put a description of the materials you want to use, the measure, the quantity, the price, and a justification for the reason. So maybe, you know, you just can't find the U.S. supplied items. The prices are too high for the U.S. supplied items that you're going to be using. But you can make a request to use foreign materials, and it's up to the contracting officer to decide if they're going to let you to allow that or not. Agency officials, so contracting officers, there you can rely on the representations made by vendors as well. They don't have to dig in. You know, if you tell the contracting officer this stuff is coming from the U.S., they're going to believe you. They don't have to go and dig and make sure that it's coming from the U.S. unless there's some kind of suspicion, unless they believe that the vendor misrepresented the origin, right? So again, this is a big gray area. You know, and this could happen from maybe another vendor could say, hey, I know that vendor you're dealing with, and there's no way that stuff's coming from the US. So that could be suspicious. Or, you know, a lot of these contracting officers, contracting specialists have been doing this for a while, and they might know already which products, which construction supplies, I'm sorry, are not coming from the US, or which are not available in the US. So they might already have that knowledge, and so it might look suspicious. But in general, they are allowed to rely on the reps made by the vendors. So the vendors, you know, you need to be truthful in your representations. There could be some big penalties if you're not truthful. Some aspects of DOD construction, like I said, we are concerned a lot about Department of Defense. The majority of all the stuff bought out here through the federal government is from the DOD. So DFARS 236274 says, do not acquire or allow a contractor to acquire steel. This is kind of what I said a few seconds ago, for which American steel producers have been denied the opportunity to compete. So that's not really outright barring the steel. It's just saying, hey, there needs to be some kind of, to make sure that every effort was made for American producers to have a shot at it. However, DOD does have restrictions on foreign acquisition, and you can see this in DFARS 22570. It's quite a long DFARS clause, and it goes through different specific items that they just say you cannot get this from a foreign supplier. And these are kind of the categories that they deal with, but they, you know, so food, they'll actually list what types of food, what type of clothing, which hand tools, which metals, buses, air circuit. So all this, it gets kind of very specific, but there are specific things that they just will not allow. And then the big thing that people probably forget about a lot is even though the Buy American Act has a lot of exceptions to it, tons of exceptions to the rule, and it really only applies to a narrow scope of purchasing, right? It applies above the micro purchase threshold and below the trade agreements threshold, kind of in that range, and then anything that's set aside for small business. That's kind of where the application comes into play. So there are a ton of exceptions, but regardless of all those exceptions, there's still another rule in place that applies to all products and all construction materials, and that is, all supplies. DOD contractors shall transport supplies exclusively on U.S. flag vessels. Right, so the stuff coming to Guam needs to come on U.S. flag vessels. Now, unless of course there's exceptions to that as well. Those vessels are not available, the charges are too high or excessive, right? Or the proposed charges to the government are higher than charges to private persons. So, which I don't know why that would be happening. And the freight charges are excessive or unreasonable. And supplies in this case is all property that is clearly identifiable for eventual use or owned by the DOD at the time of transportation by sea. So does construction materials fall into that? Not quite sure. It's kind of a gray area as well. It looks like anything that's clearly identifiable for eventual use, so all that stuff that's going into that building that's considered construction materials will be eventually used or owned by DOD. Seems like it would apply to this, but I'm not quite sure if, to me, that's a gray area. And I'm not sure if there's any court cases that have decided that yet or not. But in general, stuff coming here needs to come on U.S. flag vessels, U.S. crew, U.S. ships. So that's the Jones Act, basically, what we're talking about. Now, there can be exceptions to that. You can get a waiver to that. The FARS 252-247, 7023. And you will see this in DOD solicitations. Basically says, and it flows down subcontractors as well, but you can request the use of non-U.S. vessels. Of course, there needs to be some very good, compelling reasons for that. And so there is a process for that. 45 days prior to the sailing date, you would give the contracting office this information and say, hey. And number 7 is pretty much the key there, a documented description of all the efforts made to secure U.S. flag vessels with at least 2 characters contacted, and all the notes and anything sufficient to say, hey, why we can't do it that way, why it needs to go on a foreign vessel. So there's always exceptions, right? There's always exceptions to the exceptions. All right. Here's the executive order from Joe Biden. This was issued last year, right after he came into office, maybe a couple weeks after he came into office. So this is EO 14005, and it's related to the Buy American Act. I think it's called Ensuring the Future is Made in All of America by All of American Workers. So basically, he instructed head of all the different federal agencies to review their policies related to Buy American Act. And he created, or OMB is supposed to create, a Made in America office, which has been created. And then any agency that has a waiver request for whatever reason, they need to send that waiver request. Let's go back to the desks. We can't buy these desks in the U.S. because they're not made in the U.S. There's not enough, or they're too expensive, whatever it is. So if an agency has that kind of a waiver that they want something to be waived from Buy American, a product, they're going to have to send that to the MAO, which is the Made American Office, for review. And then the decision is made if that request is going to be accepted or not. And those waivers will be posted on a public website. And there is a public website in place. This is it. It's called madeinamerica.gov. You can check it out right now. And on the top right, there'll be a list of waivers, and you can click the waivers and see which it goes down to, actual products that have been accepted. And yes, there is a Buy American waiver for those products. And those are considered government-wide waivers. We'll take a look at the site here when I'm done with this PowerPoint. The Buy American Act also continuing on, the Buy American Act, the EO continuing on with that also is going to replace eventually the component test with a value added test. I don't believe that has happened yet. They're going to want to increase that percentage of domestic content. So right now it's at 55%, but they want to increase it to 60% and then eventually up to 75%. And they want to increase those price preferences so that, 20% for a large business, 30% for small business. They want to increase those as well. Again, none of those have gone into effect yet, even though they're supposed to start actually in July of this year. Everything is sitting at the FAR Council, and they're supposed to notify everybody within 180 days. And so you can go see, you can find this on the internet. You can find out the FAR cases, right? The Federal Acquisition Regulations, what's going on with them. So as of January 7th of this year, you can see the second item there, amendments to the FAR Buy American Act requirements. So this is where they want to implement the executive order, which requires the FAR Council basically to consider certain changes regarding the component test, and the threshold for domestic content and the price preferences. And you can see on January 6th, they received the final draft FAR rule from the DAR. I'm not quite sure who the DAR is, and they're going to discuss it on January 19th. So we still have to wait for them to discuss it, the FAR Council, and then we'll probably know, I would say maybe a month after that, if anything, if it's going to be, if the FAR is going to be updated or if it's going to go back for some further changes. This can take a while. I'll just give an example. For the FAR Council can take a while. For example, the woman-owned small business certification, that was actually put into the NDAA in 2016, and saying, it needs to take effect basically, I don't know, within 180 days, something like that. It didn't come into play until 2020, right, is when it actually went into effect. So sometimes it can take the FAR Council a long time to get these things listed in the FAR and get them into effect. But the point here with this is letting you know about this is that Buy American Act is probably only going to get more stringent. Again, like I said, it covers only a very, very small range from the micro purchase threshold up to where the trade agreements kick in. And then, of course, if it's a small business set aside, it applies to those. But it's going to get more stringent. There is a big push to get more things made in the US. So we are going to see this domestic content requirement increase. We're going to see the price preferences increase. So it's going to get a little harder for foreign made products to be considered American made and get the exemptions and the exceptions to the rule. So that's what we're looking at here. Let's see. So basically, in summary, the Buy American Act it's basically an attempt to protect U.S. businesses by restricting acquisition and use of end products, things that are not domestic. There's price preferences put into place. There's a ton of exceptions, right, below the micro purchase threshold for stuff outside the U.S., not in public interest exception. There's unavailability. The price is unreasonable. Commercial off-the-shelf technology is exempted from it. Commissary resale is exempted from it. And of course, trade agreements kick in and the Buy American Act is waived. DOD has said these countries, that list of countries there, it's waived for them. So there's a ton of exemptions to it. Let me stop the share here and go straight to that Buy American website. Sorry, jumping around, but let me just share the screen here. So this is the madeinamerica.gov website. Hopefully you can all see this. And this is what I was talking about. Let me get this out of the way here. You can view the waivers just by clicking this little view waivers. And you can see, I saw that Jones Act waiver popped up real quick and disappeared. But so they have product service codes already. So let's say Department of the Navy, what is this? A dual tone doorbell. So if I wanted to know more about that, I could just click it. It'll open up. And I can see that, okay, market research was accomplished. I'm reading over here for the waiver rationale. And no dual tone doorbell manufactured in America was found by either the government, by a source of thought, or the contractor and their subcontractor. So they'll be selling the government a foreign made one, and that'll be considered domestic because there is no US source. I guess Nicor, I'm not sure who they are. All units are manufactured overseas, and it would be impossible to find one manufactured in America. So you can go through here and look through and see if there's anything related to products that you might sell. There's not really a lot on this list yet, I don't believe. It's only 2 pages long. I'm interested in that Jones Act waiver. Where did that come from? Oh, here we go. So we'd have to go to the DOT transportation. Maybe we'll save that for another workshop. But this is the website where you can go and see the waivers. You can also find more about Made in America and what they want to do with the program. There's also on the bottom here a bunch of frequently asked questions. And so, you know, what's the policy? What if I want to make comments about a waiver? Because some people will say, hey, we couldn't find it. And then a manufacturer will raise his hand, you know, just stumble across this website and go, hey, I make that thing. And so you can comment. And basically, you just need to email Made in America at omb.eop.gov and let them know what's going on. Like here, I saw a non-availability waiver issued for a product I know is made in America. What should I do? It's going to say email them. Yeah. All right. And this question was asked. I heard that 5% is no longer the threshold because, like I said, they're going to want to raise it to 60. That, in fact, and that's because President Biden put out an executive order. The one I showed you was from January. I think he put out another one in July where he said effective immediately, we're raising it to 60%. However, it has not gone through the FAR council and has not been updated in the FAR. So it still is at 55%. And so the answer, yeah, the 55 is currently in effect. Yeah. Okay. So this is where you can find a little bit more about what's going on with the future of Made in America. So let me stop the share here and I'm gonna open it up to any questions. Anybody have any questions? Feel free to just unmute yourself and ask away. If you don't want to talk about Buy America, anything else related to federal procurement, that'll be fine as well. All right, everybody's shy today. So if there are no questions, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and hopefully we'll see everyone next week when we talk about, I always forget.
SBIR?
Oh yeah, so we're going to talk about SBIR, STTR. So this is, you know, if you have any friends out there that are inventors, this is a great program for them. These two programs basically is the government saying, hey, we will give you money to create the thing you want to invent. And if we like it, we will buy it from you. And so that's what those two basic programs do. And we'll discuss all the rules and the different agencies involved in these two programs. So it'll be great. So if you, like I said, if you know anybody out there who creates things or has a great idea for a product that they think the government might want, this is a great way to get it funded for free, basically. So see everyone next week, Thursday, 10 o'clock. And thanks for joining us today. Have a great week, everyone.